States, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Morning, Mick.
It's great to have you here this morning. Of course, Creation Ministries International have their own website, creation.com, where you can get all sorts of questions answered. However, we like it when you send those questions through to us. Dr. John can answer them on air and help everybody else. There's a lot of other people that might have the same question as you. Simply send those questions through to our text line 0401 949 949. And we love getting those questions, don't we, Dr. John?
We certainly do, Mick, and we get some great ones, and we've got some good ones again this morning.
Absolutely. Well, we got one that came in after our talk last week. Understand your explanation of how Uluru was formed. Why can't it be millions of years old, like it is said it is?
Yeah, well, look, it's a very good question, and there's actually a short answer and a long answer to that question, and I'm going to give both because both are really important and both are relevant to the things that we've been talking about. You know, the short answer really relates to the true history of the world. Now, the Bible says the world is about 6,000 years old. It was created perfect in the beginning, and after about 1,600 years, it was destroyed by a global flood.
Yes.
And the earth that we now live on was formed with its oceans, its rocks, and its mountain ranges by that flood and the things that followed on from it. So that's the biblical view. But the secular scientific world says that it's billions of years old and that all the sedimentary rocks, all the topography we see, was put down in layers over billions of years with millions of years gaps between the layers. Now, obviously, both stories can't be right.
Yeah.
But the point is, and this is where the short answer comes in, if the Bible is true, the millions and billions of years are non-existent. They just don't exist. They're pure fantasy. And secular science is actually deluded in believing that the earth is billions of years old. So that's the short answer. Now, the long answer really is the reason that we exist at Creation Ministries. We're here to reveal the truth. That's really our purpose in life. And we come straight down to the level of the secular scientists, and we address the evidence on which they base their belief. Now, science, after all, is about observation and experimentation within the very consistent framework of chemistry, physics, and mathematics. And they use that framework and the evidence that they see, and they come to certain conclusions.
Yeah.
Now, the millions of years is one of those conclusions. So what our job is to do is to look at exactly the same evidence and demonstrate the flaws in those conclusions based on that evidence. Now, we need to remember that everybody has access to exactly the same evidence. There is no set of evidence for creationists and no different set of evidence for evolutionists or long-age people. Exactly the same evidence. So really, we then have to look at the evidence and see the question related to the sedimentary layers deposited at Uluru and whether they can be millions of years old. Okay, so when we have a look at sedimentary rock layers generally, and they occur all over the world, heaps of them in Australia, we then look at that and we see, is there evidence from observing that sedimentary rock that means it could not be millions of years old? Okay? Now, we don't have to go far to have a look at that. I mean, it's all over the world. There's plenty in Australia. You can go to the Blue Mountains and see all the sedimentary rock. You can go to the Great Ocean Road. You can go to Kakadu. You can go down the M1 to Sydney. You can go to Terrigal and walk along the rocks towards the Skillion and have a look behind you. And you see it everywhere. 75% of the Earth's surface is covered in that sedimentary rock.
Yeah.
So, creationists and secular scientists both agree that that sort of sediment was formed by flowing water depositing those sediments. There's absolutely no argument about that. Everybody believes the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to observations, are there some things that would suggest the millions of years are wrong? And that's what I'm going to talk about when we come back.
Ooh, sounds exciting. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's answering your questions on 0401 949 949. And just before we go into this break, Tracy sent a question just in regards to a song that we played at about 7:45. She loved this song, and it was a song called King by Becca Shea. Tracy, there you go. It is 8:15. We'll be back with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's been speaking to us this morning about, Uluru, well, not just Uluru, about millions and billions of years. The question we had that came in after last week's talk was, I understood your explanation of how Uluru was formed. Why can't it be millions of years old like it said it was? And, of course, Dr. John's been telling us this morning that there's sedimentary rock all over the planet, and that sedimentary rock has, I guess both creationists and evolutionists agree that that sedimentary rock was put there by water. What else can you tell us, Dr. John?
Yes, well, the question, of course, is why can't it be millions of years old?
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned one of the reasons last week why we can look at certain sedimentary rocks. And let's face it, everybody agrees that all the sedimentary rocks all over the world were formed in largely the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't it be millions of years old? Well, there are a lot of places in the world where you see a whole lot of sedimentary rock layers bent into different shapes, particularly U shapes or S shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at that shape, you can see that the rock is not broken. Now, you can't bend rock without breaking it because obviously it will fracture. And the only way that that rock could have formed and be bent into that shape as if it was bent when the sedimentary layers were still soft sand.
Mm-hmm.
So the soft sand, they then get bent, and then the sediment hardens into rock. Now, because we know that rock doesn't bend, that means that the time between all of those different layers being laid down has got to be days or weeks or months. It can't possibly be millions of years. So that's one example that you can point to, and you can say those sedimentary rocks could not have been laid down one layer after another with millions of years gaps between the layers. So that's one example. But there are a lot of places throughout the world where we observe what we call polystrate tree trunks. Now, what are they? These are fossilized trees that are embedded in the sedimentary rock. And when you look at those fossilized tree trunks, you find that they don't have any roots on them.
Mm-hmm.
So they were obviously transported by water along with the sediment. Mm-hmm. And you see that they extend vertically through several layers of sediment. Now, again, that means it's impossible for those layers to have had millions of year gaps between them. Otherwise, the tree trunks would have rotted.
Yeah.
So those polystrate tree trunks are another example of why the layers had to have been laid down over a short space of time.
Yes.
They're pretty common all over the world. We've got plenty of examples in Australia. Even here on the Central Coast, we've got examples of that. And they're very common, too, in coal seams. You frequently find a vertical coalified tree trunk extending through several coal seams and the sediment in between the coal seams.
So they don't have roots. There's no roots. So they must have been literally transported.
Been off them.
Yeah, so they're transported inside
right.
a whole lot of sediment all at the same time.
Yeah, so that automatically means that they cannot have been laid down over millions of years.
Mm.
And then if we have a look at rock dating, I mean, everybody's aware that the world gives dates to rocks of millions and billions of years. But there's some flaws actually in the rock dating, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment.
This is sounding very exciting. You're on 94.9. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's telling us why the world can't be millions of years old. It's only 6,000 years old. It is 24 minutes past 8. We'll be back shortly. From Creation Ministries International, he's been telling us why Uluru and the world can't be millions of years old. We've been looking at rock layers and talking about all the silt in the layers, and I remember you telling us about the time you went to Cooper Pedy, Dr. John. You went underground and you asked the guy there. It was Cooper Pedy, wasn't it?
It was Cooper Pedy, yeah.
Yep, you went underground and apparently you asked the guy, what's the difference in all the bits and pieces they're finding way down deep and the stuff right up the top? And he said, well, no, it's the same sort of, pieces and shells and everything else that they're finding at hugely different depths in the mine.
Yes, he said that it didn't matter how far you went down, you didn't find any gradation in fossils in the sand. It was all the same all the way down.
What does gradation mean?
There are a lot of other things that we can use to demonstrate that those layers simply can't be millions and billions of years old. And what we're doing, you see, is we're using science itself to demonstrate that those millions of years have to be imaginary. And what that really means is that people are actually faced with a choice. And I've said this many times on the program, this is why we exist at Creation Ministries, because all of us are bombarded with those millions and billions of years claims. But that effectively says that the Bible's not true. Now, what we try to do is show that the scientific evidence is much more consistent with the biblical account than it is with the conventional scientific opinion.
Yep.
Now, we can't prove the Bible's true, but we can point to it being consistent with the evidence. And because the eternal consequences of not believing the Bible are so dreadful, people really need to take note of what it says about the major character in it. And of course, the major character in the whole Bible is Jesus. And we ignore him at our eternal peril, because the Word of God tells us that there is no way back to God the Father except through Jesus. So we cannot afford to ignore him. And if we suspect that the Bible might be wrong in some areas, we're more likely to suspect it might be wrong in the stories about Jesus. Well, it isn't, and we verified those by pointing to the rest of the Bible being obviously verifiably true.
Yes, and of course, science, sadly, isn't as clear-cut as people think. You've said it many times, there isn't an instrument that can measure an age. Instead, they talk about certain instruments that can measure some little pieces, but then there's so much that goes into it that is all just speculation and guesswork. And sadly, without that instrument, we literally have to look at things like you've said many times, eyewitnesses, and they've talked about stuff in the Bible, including Jesus and including those times that go back for quite a long way. And Jesus even preached from the Old Testament, talking about those things.
Well, he had to, because there wasn't a New Testament when he was preaching.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Okay, and then Dr. John, we had another question last week. Are we ready for that one yet?
Yes, we are, Mick, and I thought that was really interesting. You can read it out so that people have got an idea of what our listener was after.
Absolutely. The question was, hi, Dr. John, after the 12 tribes of Israel had been scattered across the world, is there any way to distinctly identify each of them today?
A very interesting question, and I'm not sure what our listener was getting at, because there's lots of rumours out there that suggest that a lot of the people who claim to be Jewish are not actually Jewish, and that other groups who don't know that they're Jewish actually are. And so I'm going to talk about that this morning, and I think that's really what our listener might have been after. And included in that answer, we'll be able to talk about the scattering of the 12 tribes and whether they can identify each other.
That sounds exciting. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's been talking to us this morning about, well, first, the age of the earth and why it can't be millions of years old. And then we've been answering a question. After the 12 tribes of Israel had been scattered across the world, is there any way to distinctly identify each of them today? And you were just telling us, Dr. John, it could be a little confusing for some people. Some people might be Jewish and they don't know. Others might not be. I'm a little confused myself right now. How do we know? Well, that's a big question.
It is a big question, Mick, and I think we have to look at it right from the beginning. Who actually are the Jewish people? And of course, the original term for them was Hebrew or Israelite. Mm-hmm. And the word Hebrew comes from one of Abraham's ancestors, a guy called Eber. So Abraham was called a Hebrew. And of course, he had his son Isaac and then his son Jacob. And God changed Jacob's name to Israel. So the descendants of Jacob or Israel are the people that we have traditionally called the Israelites. Mm-hmm. The word Jew actually comes from one of Jacob's sons, Judah. And the southern kingdom, where after Solomon, the Jewish people were divided into those two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which continued with the term Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was then called Judah. And of course, both of those kingdoms got destroyed at different times. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians back in the 8th century BC, and then of course the southern kingdom was destroyed by the Babylonians back in at the beginning of the 6th century BC.
Yep.
So I suppose most of the tribes lived in the northern kingdom, and when they were scattered, they interbred with the invaders and so on, and they became the Samaritans. And of course, the Jewish people believed they were of more pure stock than the Samaritans, so they despised the Samaritans. And there's a lot of that recorded in the Gospels. Mm-hmm. But the Old Testament Jews did keep meticulous records of their descent, and they all did know what their ancestor was, which one of the sons of Jacob they were descended from. But they still called themselves Jews. And we see the Apostle Paul, who was of the tribe of Benjamin, he still called himself a Jew. And we know that from Chronicles that many of the northern kingdom tribes were represented in the southern kingdom anyway. Chronicles talks about how Ephraim and Manasseh were there, as well as Judah and Benjamin. When Jesus was presented in the temple, there was a prophetess there called Anna, and she was of the tribe of Asher. So many of the tribal groups were represented in the southern kingdom. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and the Jewish people were scattered all over the world. They had lived in enclaves all over the world even before that. I mean, there were many in Babylon, there were many in Persia. You might remember that Esther was a Jewess who was married to the king of Persia back in about the 5th century BC. Mm-hmm. So there were plenty of them around, and wherever they were, they built synagogues. And that's why Paul could go on his travels throughout of what we would now call Turkey and Greece, and he would always go to the synagogue, because the Jewish people of what they called the diaspora or the dispersion all used to worship in their synagogues, because they weren't anywhere near the temple in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And when Peter writes his first letter, he specifically writes it to all the Jewish people of the dispersion who were all over the world. So they knew they were Jews, and they knew that they were descended from those original sons of Jacob. But all of the written records of their descent were destroyed when the Romans destroyed the temple back in AD 70. So although the Jewish people now know which tribe they came from, there's no way anybody else, any outsider, can go and tell that. And there have been a lot of nasty rumours throughout the history, I suppose, saying that a lot of people who call themselves Jews are not Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was put out in books by various people, and I suppose we can say that most of the Jews today belong to either what they call the Sephardic Jews or the Ashkenazi Jews, one coming from North Africa and Spain and the other from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, all right. Wow. Well, there's a history of the Jewish people almost, isn't it?
It is, and it's really very interesting, and I do want to correct a couple of bits of misinformation that are around, and when we come back I'll do just that.
Absolutely. It is 8 minutes to 9. You're on 94.9 with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Answering your questions, simply send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, he's been telling us a bit about the Jewish people, the 12 tribes, and I'd like to know, John, is, a lot of people claim to be Jewish. Are they all Jewish? I mean, some people say some Jews aren't really Jews. How do we know?
The evidence, Mick, from genetics shows that really they are, by and large, and some of those accusations that have been levelled at them historically simply aren't true, because the genetic evidence does show that really they are Jewish. But in a sense, it doesn't matter anymore, Mick, because we're all part of spiritual Israel, both Jew and Gentile.
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah prophesied that the salvation that Jesus offered would be extended to everybody on earth, and all of those who put their trust in him, both Jew and Gentile, are now accepted as the family of God. So really, it doesn't matter anymore.
How good's
the
that?
Apostle Paul says there's no difference between us anymore. Adherence to any set of laws are not going to get us our salvation. For all of us, it's only by putting our faith and trust in what the Lord Jesus Christ has done for us.
So I'm as good as a Jew.
Yeah, you are. Doesn't make any difference, Mick.
Ah, that's awesome. Well, Dr. John, is that it for this week?
Yes, that's it for this week, Mick, and keep the questions coming because we look at answering them next week.
Absolutely. Of course, you can send your questions through to our text line 0401 949 949. Send them through right now. Any questions you've got to do with creation, to do with evolution, or maybe to do with little green men from Mars, or even the dinosaurs, send those questions through to 0401 949 949. And Dr. John can deal with them next week. Thank you so much again, Dr. John. Another amazing week with awesome information and very interesting, talking about the ages. The more I hear you speaking about the age of Earth and about the instruments that are used, or rather the instruments that aren't used, it really clears that question up as to how old is the world. And we realise that there is no instrument to measure the age, and quite often they're just throwing numbers around and comparing something to something else that somebody said was a certain age. But at the end of the day, it's that lack of that instrument really tells the story, doesn't it?
That's right. There is no instrument that will actually measure a date. It's all got to be indirect calculations, and you can see the flaws in the calculations as they're used.
Yes. That is absolutely amazing. Well, thank you again, Dr. John. Another amazing week, and you'll be back next Tuesday?
I will, Mick. We'll see you then.
Excellent. Well, I guess you can't really go far at the moment, can you? We're sort of
No, we can't.
locked down. But look, hopefully you'll be back in the studio soon, Dr. John. That would be awesome. I'm looking forward to that. I like being able to ask you.
Be nice to be back in the studio.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that was awesome. It is 8:59. You're on 94.9. We've got the news and weather coming up next. And, that's pretty much it for the morning.